In Revenge of the Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell revisits the groundbreaking idea he introduced in his bestseller, The Tipping Point, where small, seemingly insignificant changes can lead to massive, widespread shifts in behavior or societal norms. But in this new narrative, Gladwell explores the unforeseen consequences when tipping points come back with a twist, when the very ideas, trends, and changes we initiate begin to push back against us, creating unexpected reversals in culture, technology, and even human behavior. It's a story about cause and effect, and how the ripple effects of even the smallest decisions can change the world in ways we never imagined. Gladwell masterfully weaves historical examples, scientific research, and modern-day phenomena into a compelling analysis of how tipping points can become forces of backlash and evolution. Malcolm Gladwell begins by revisiting his groundbreaking theory from the tipping point, which proposed that small, seemingly insignificant causes could lead to massive effects. His original work explained how social phenomena, trends, and behaviors spread like epidemics once they reached a critical mass, once they hit the tipping point. Gladwell emphasizes how this theory reshaped the way we understand change, whether it be in consumer behavior, fashion, social movements, or even crime rates. At its core, the tipping point theory posited that specific factors, such as the involvement of key influencers, the law of the few, the compelling nature of the message, stickiness, and the environment in which the message spreads, the power of context, come together to trigger exponential growth in movements and trends. But in this book, Gladwell takes the discussion further by examining what happens after a tipping point is reached. The initial success of a movement or trend can sometimes create unintended consequences that spiral beyond anyone's control. Gladwell dives deep into how these forces can swing back in unexpected ways, showing that tipping points are not simply the end of the story. They can also be the beginning of a new, often more unpredictable chapter. For example, in the rise of social media, the tipping point occurred when platforms like Facebook and Twitter gained enough users to influence global communication. However, the aftermath has revealed consequences that no one predicted. Misinformation spreading at unprecedented rates, concerns over data privacy, and the fracturing of public discourse. He uses this example to illustrate that tipping points are not inherently positive or negative. They are simply moments when the scale tips in one direction. What happens afterward can be just as crucial to understanding societal change. The rise of the internet is another case in point. While it tipped society into an age of information sharing and connection, it also gave rise to new challenges, like cybercrime and online exploitation, that had not been foreseen. The tipping point of any significant change, Gladwell argues, should be viewed not as a final destination, but as a critical moment that often leads to complex, unforeseen results. In essence, the tipping point is not a static concept. It's a dynamic process that involves constant feedback and adaptation. Trends, movements, and even products may reach a point of mass acceptance, but that very success can also sow the seeds for their eventual downfall. The same context that helps something thrive can shift, leading to a reverse tipping point where the once successful idea faces decline or backlash. Building on the idea that tipping points are not the final chapter in a phenomenon's life cycle, Gladwell transitions in Section 2 to explore what he calls the revenge of the tipping point. He delves into the often overlooked reality that the success of a trend or movement, once it reaches its tipping point, can generate unintended consequences, some of which can completely reverse the positive momentum that originally drove it forward. This revenge is when the very forces that once catapulted an idea or movement into success begin to work against it, leading to a new tipping point in the opposite direction. Gladwell emphasizes that the factors which make an idea or trend spread rapidly, such as key influencers, appealing messaging, and environmental factors, can evolve over time, often creating a backlash effect. As society changes, so too does the perception of what was once seen as revolutionary or beneficial. A prime example is the explosion of social media, which initially tipped the scales toward greater global connectivity and information sharing. However, as social platforms grew in influence, The sheer volume of users and content led to issues such as misinformation, addiction, and the erosion of privacy. These unintended consequences illustrate the revenge of social media's tipping point, where the same elements that fueled its rise, ease of access, viral content, and global reach, have now also become its biggest challenges. Gladwell explains that this reversal often happens because success changes the context. In the early stages of a movement or trend, the environment is fertile, and the message resonates deeply with early adopters. But once it reaches mass acceptance, the very nature of the environment shifts. Take, for instance, the fashion industry. A unique trend might start as a niche movement, embraced by a select group of trendsetters. But once it hits the mainstream and becomes widely adopted, the uniqueness that made it appealing in the first place fades. It becomes over-commercialized and loses its original appeal, triggering a new tipping point where consumers seek something fresh and different. Gladwell also points out that influencers, or what he calls connectors, people with a wide network, and mavens, knowledgeable experts, who help spread a trend initially, can become part of the problem in the post-tipping point phase. Once a trend becomes ubiquitous, these same influencers often distance themselves from it, contributing to its decline. Their desire to remain ahead of the curve or to distinguish themselves from the mainstream leads them to distance themselves from something they previously championed. This withdrawal can create a ripple effect, causing others to follow suit. What was once a hot trend loses its luster, and a cultural shift in the opposite direction begins. In essence, the social and cultural forces that created the tipping point eventually create a reverse tipping point, where the very factors that drove success now contribute to a downfall or backlash. This idea challenges the common assumption that once a tipping point is reached, a trend will maintain its success indefinitely. Instead, Gladwell argues that tipping points are followed by complex phases of growth, adaptation, and at times, self-destruction. By showing how tipping points can turn against their origin, Gladwell introduces a new layer of complexity to the way we think about social dynamics and the life cycle of movements, trends, and even products. In this way, the revenge of the tipping point forces us to reconsider not just how ideas spread, but how they endure or fail in a constantly changing environment. Continuing from the idea that tipping points and their aftermath are subject to unexpected reversals, Gladwell dives deeper into the role of what he calls secondary tipping points. These are moments when an already established trend, movement, or idea experiences a shift in trajectory, either doubling down on its success or spiraling into decline. What makes secondary tipping points fascinating is their unpredictability. There is often no way to foresee when or how they will emerge. Gladwell uses the example of the music industry to illustrate this concept. Consider a groundbreaking album or artist that hits the mainstream after years of underground success. The first tipping point comes when the artist becomes a household name, a cultural force that redefines the music landscape. However, a secondary tipping point might arise unexpectedly, pushing the artist in a new direction. For instance, as public interest begins to fade, a collaboration with a new, younger artist or a sudden resurgence of nostalgia for their earlier work could send the artist back into the spotlight. Alternatively, the reverse could happen. Negative press, a change in societal attitudes, or even the artist's decision to experiment with a new style could lead to a rapid decline in popularity. These secondary tipping points highlight that success is often fleeting and that every peak is followed by a new valley or plateau, dictated by forces outside of the original trend's control. Gladwell also explores how these secondary tipping points are not solely driven by external factors like technology or economics, but are deeply intertwined with human emotions, behaviors, and reactions. It is often the human element, our fears, desires, organizational fatigue or overconfidence, and responses to uncertainty, that either accelerates a movement or halts it in its tracks. He describes how many tech startups, after experiencing meteoric growth following an initial tipping point, struggle to maintain the momentum. Once they dominate their niche, the initial hunger and drive that propelled them to success can fade. Team members may become complacent, or leadership might shift their focus away from innovation and toward maintenance. As a result, these companies are vulnerable to disruption by newer, more agile competitors, leading to a secondary tipping point that spells their downfall. Gladwell cites Blockbuster as a classic example. At one point, Blockbuster was the dominant force in video rentals, riding the wave of a cultural tipping point where home entertainment became mainstream. However, the company reached a secondary tipping point when it failed to adapt to the rise of streaming services like Netflix. Blockbuster's executives underestimated the power of this technological shift, clinging to their established business model even as consumer preferences shifted. This failure to recognize and respond to a secondary tipping point led to Blockbuster's rapid decline, illustrating how previously successful trends can collapse when those involved fail to navigate new challenges. Through these examples, Gladwell reinforces the idea that no tipping point guarantees eternal success. The forces that influence whether a trend survives or falters are constantly in flux, and understanding the role of secondary tipping points is crucial for staying ahead. Whether it's a new competitor, changing consumer tastes, or shifts in technology, these moments of transformation can completely alter the trajectory of an idea, sometimes with little warning. Building upon the idea that tipping points are not isolated events but part of a broader, cyclical process, the final section of Gladwell's exploration delves into the concept of sustainability after a tipping point has been reached. Once a trend, product, or movement has gained significant traction, the next challenge lies in maintaining that momentum. Gladwell argues that while reaching a tipping point is a pivotal achievement, it is by no means the end of the journey. In fact, the real test begins once success has been attained. How do you keep a trend alive in an ever-evolving landscape where attention spans are short and competition is fierce? One key factor Gladwell identifies in sustaining momentum is adaptability. He explains that successful movements or businesses must remain fluid, adjusting their strategies to align with new market conditions or shifts in public sentiment. The challenge here is that the factors which initially drove a movement to its tipping point may no longer be effective once the tipping point is reached. Gladwell draws attention to the phenomenon of trends burning out when they fail to evolve beyond their initial appeal. He cites examples from the fashion industry where certain brands or styles achieve sudden popularity only to fade out of relevance within a few seasons. The fast-paced nature of consumer tastes in this sector demands constant reinvention. Brands that succeed in the long term are those that anticipate changes in public interest and innovate before their product becomes stale. To further illustrate this, Gladwell looks at the technology sector, where maintaining momentum is even more critical due to the rapid pace of innovation. He references Apple, a company known not only for its groundbreaking products, but for its ability to continuously create excitement and anticipation around each new release. Apple's success wasn't just about the initial tipping point when the iPhone revolutionized mobile technology. It was about how the company sustained its dominance by constantly improving, adapting, and anticipating customer needs. By launching new features, enhancing design, and maintaining a narrative of innovation, Apple managed to keep the momentum going, avoiding the pitfalls that have trapped countless other tech giants. Gladwell emphasizes that leadership and vision are crucial to sustaining this post-tipping point momentum. A company or movement's ability to retain relevance often hinges on its leaders' foresight and willingness to take risks. He highlights how Netflix, originally a DVD rental company, navigated its own tipping point with the rise of streaming. Rather than clinging to its original business model, Netflix pivoted aggressively, investing in streaming technology and original content long before the market caught up to this vision. This strategic adaptability allowed Netflix to not only survive but thrive, even as its competitors faltered. Moreover, Gladwell explores how community and culture play essential roles in keeping trends alive. Movements that foster strong communities, whether social, political, or commercial, tend to endure longer because they create a sense of shared identity and purpose among participants. These communities act as sustainers of the movement, ensuring that even as mainstream attention waxes and wanes, a core group of dedicated individuals remains invested in its success. The resurgence of vinyl records, for instance, is a case in point. While mainstream music consumption has largely shifted to digital platforms, the vinyl community has remained passionate, helping to fuel a niche but growing market for physical records. Finally, Gladwell concludes that tipping points are not final destinations, but rather waypoints in a larger, ongoing journey. The success of any trend depends not just on the factors that create the initial spark, but on the ability to nurture, adapt, and evolve once the fire has caught. Leaders must be constantly aware of the shifting forces around them, whether technological, cultural, or economic, and be ready to respond before their momentum fades. This insight serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, reminding us that while achieving a tipping point may seem like the ultimate goal, the real challenge and opportunity lies in what comes after. Thank you so much for listening and joining us. If you enjoyed the audiobook, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more book summaries that help you expand your mind. Drop a comment below to let us know which book you'd like us to explore next, and we'll consider it for our upcoming episodes. We look forward to bringing you more valuable content right here on Page by Page. Until next time, keep learning and growing.